On the morning of March 19, 1847, Father Michael Donovan of the Diocese of Boston descended the stone steps into the crypt beneath St. Brigid's Convent Chapel with a lantern that cast trembling shadows against walls that had stood for 23 years. What he discovered in that damp darkness would lead to his immediate collapse and subsequent hospitalization for nervous exhaustion, a condition from which, according to his physician's notes preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, he never fully recovered. The crypt contained 17 wooden crates. Each crate bore carefully painted Latin inscriptions that Father Donovan initially mistook for biblical passages. They were not. Inside these crates, wrapped in fine Belgian linen typically reserved for altar cloths, were the preserved remains of 11 infants, 4 young women, and 2 elderly sisters of the order. But it was not merely their presence that caused Father Donovan's collapse. It was the meticulous documentation found beside them, a leather-bound ledger, written in an elegant hand, describing in clinical detail the circumstances surrounding each death, the dates, the methods, and most horrifying of all, the theological justifications. The ledger's final entry, dated March 13, 1847, 6 days before the discovery, reads simply, "Sister Agnes Mary Catherine O'Brien has been delivered from her earthly corruption. The purification is complete. May God have mercy on my soul for the mercy I have shown his flock." Sister Agnes had vanished without a trace, and as Father Donovan would soon learn, she was but the final victim in a conspiracy of sanctified horror that had operated beneath the veneer of pious charity for more than a decade. What the subsequent investigation would uncover would force the diocese to confront an unspeakable truth. The most dangerous predator is the one who wears the mask of holiness. Before we descend further into this documented nightmare, I need to speak directly to those of you watching. This channel exists for one purpose: to drag forgotten horrors from the sealed archives of history and force us to confront the capacity for evil that hides behind respectable facades. The case of Sister Agnes and St. Brigid's Convent represents one of the most thoroughly suppressed scandals in American Catholic history. The official records were sealed by episcopal order in 1849 and remained classified for 127 years. If you're new here, subscribe now and activate notifications. These stories, drawn from court documents, asylum records, and correspondence collections that most people will never access, need to be remembered. They need to be told. Each week, we pull back the curtain on cases that powerful institutions tried desperately to bury. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, the story you're about to hear is among the darkest we've ever covered. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, your city, your state, your country. This channel has become a gathering place for those brave enough to look at history's ugliest truths without flinching. You are the true mystery seekers, the ones who understand that the worst monsters are often the ones we trust most completely. I ask only that you share this video with others who have the courage to listen. Because what happened at St. Brigid's Convent didn't happen in some distant, medieval past. It happened in America, in a major city, less than 200 years ago. And if you think such horrors couldn't happen today, I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll question everything you think you know about institutional authority. The worst is yet to come. The year 1847 marked the 3rd year of Ngorta Mór, the great hunger that would ultimately kill or displace nearly 2 million Irish souls. By that winter, Boston had become a primary destination for Irish Catholic refugees fleeing starvation and British indifference. The city's population swelled with desperate families, most arriving with nothing but the clothes they wore and the faith that had sustained them through horrors beyond description. St. Brigid's Convent stood on a modest property in the south end of Boston, established in 1824 by the Sisters of Mercy to serve the growing Irish Catholic community. The building itself was an austere 3-story structure of red brick and gray stone, unremarkable in its architecture, but commanding in its position atop a gentle hill overlooking the neighborhood. Behind the main convent building stood a smaller chapel, completed in 1829, its single bell tower visible from several streets away, a landmark that brought comfort to the faithful who heard its call to prayer 3 times daily. By all contemporary accounts, St. Brigid's was precisely what it claimed to be, a refuge for the vulnerable. The convent housed approximately 18 sisters at any given time, operating a small school for Irish girls, a charity kitchen that fed dozens of destitute families each week, and a Magdalene house, a residence for unwed mothers and women deemed in need of moral correction. This combination of services was typical for Catholic institutions of the period, representing the church's efforts to minister to an immigrant population that faced tremendous prejudice from Boston's Protestant establishment. The convent's Mother Superior, Sister Mary Lucia Brennan, had led the community since 1838. Born in County Cork in 1801, she had emigrated to Boston at age 23 with her family, taking her vows with the Sisters of Mercy in 1827. By all contemporary accounts preserved in diocesan correspondence, Mother Lucia was considered exceptionally devout, tireless in her service, and beloved by both her fellow sisters and the families she served. Father Patrick Healy, pastor of St. Augustine's Church, the parish to which the convent was attached, wrote in an 1844 letter to the bishop that Mother Lucia possessed a zeal for souls that burns with apostolic fire, and that her tender care for the unfortunate women and children in her charge is a living example of Christ's love for the outcast. The Magdalene House, in particular, was considered a vital mercy in those desperate years. Young women who had fallen pregnant outside of marriage faced utter destitution in 1840s Boston. Rejected by their families, unable to work, facing starvation on the streets, the convent offered them sanctuary. They could live at St. Brigid's throughout their pregnancy, give birth in safety, and after a suitable period of penance and moral instruction, potentially be restored to their families or helped to find honest employment. Their children, if the mothers proved unable to care for them, would be placed with Catholic families seeking to adopt. It was, on its face, a system of organized compassion. Documents from the Boston Archdiocese indicate that between 1838 and 1847, St. Brigid's Magdalene House admitted 43 young women. Of those 43, the official records show that 14 remained at the convent, taking vows as lay sisters. 9 returned to their families. 12 were placed in domestic service positions arranged by the convent. 8 left of their own accord to destinations unknown. The records show 26 children born at the convent during those years. 18 were adopted by Catholic families. 8 died in infancy, an unremarkable figure for the time, when infant mortality rates hovered near 30% even in the best circumstances. But these numbers, preserved in neat columns in Mother Lucia's own handwriting in the convent's official register, would later be revealed as a masterpiece of systematic deception. The truth was so carefully hidden, so meticulously disguised as charity, that it operated in plain sight for nearly a decade. And the genius of the deception lay precisely in how ordinary, how unremarkable, how utterly consistent with the expected norms of Catholic charity it all appeared. Sister Agnes Mary Catherine O'Brien had arrived at St. Brigid's Convent on November 4, 1846. She was 19 years old, originally from County Galway, and had recently arrived in Boston with her widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. According to the intake record signed by Mother Lucia, Agnes sought to discern a vocation to religious life, and had been sponsored by Father Healy, who knew the O'Brien family from his pastoral work in their neighborhood. She was described as pious in disposition, quiet in manner, and eager to serve God through service to his poor. She had received an unusual level of education for a girl of her background. Her father had been a schoolteacher before his death from famine fever, and could read Latin, a rare skill that made her valuable for assisting with the liturgical preparations. Sister Agnes entered as a postulant, wearing the simple gray dress of one testing her vocation before taking formal vows. By all accounts from those who knew her during those first months, she was precisely what she appeared. A devout young woman seeking purpose and security in religious life while helping her family survive. She worked in the convent kitchen, assisted with the school, and helped care for the women in the Magdalene House. No one suspected that in 4 short months, she would vanish completely, and no one could have imagined the truth she would discover before she disappeared. Mother Lucia's genius lay in her understanding of how institutions protect themselves through the appearance of transparency. Every aspect of St. Brigid's operation was documented, accounted for, and available for inspection by diocesan authorities. Father Healy visited weekly to hear confessions and celebrate Mass. The bishop himself had toured the facilities in 1843 and praised Mother Lucia's administration in a letter that was read aloud at a gathering of sisters from various convents. The key to maintaining this deception was compartmentalization. The convent operated on a strict schedule with clearly defined roles. The sisters who taught in the school rarely interacted with those who worked in the Magdalene House. The sisters who managed the charity kitchen had minimal contact with those who supervised the laundry, which provided modest income by taking in washing from wealthy Protestant families. Each sister knew her duties, performed them with religious devotion, and understood that curiosity about matters outside her responsibility was a form of pride to be mortified. Mother Lucia herself managed all relationships with the outside world. She corresponded with the diocese, met with prospective adoptive families, handled all financial matters, and maintained the official registers. Sister Josephine Maguire, her assistant and confidant for nearly 8 years, helped with administrative tasks and managed the Magdalene house under Mother Lucia's close supervision. The women in the Magdalene house, never more than 4 or 5 at any time, were kept separate from the professed sisters. They ate separately, prayed separately, and were discouraged from forming attachments with anyone beyond their immediate supervisors. This was presented as spiritually necessary. They were in a period of penance and should focus on prayer, not socializing. Most of these women, already traumatized by pregnancy, abandonment, and social shame, accepted these conditions gratefully. They had shelter, food, and safety, luxuries beyond measure in 1840s Boston. Margaret Sullivan, who served as laundress at the convent from 1843 to 1847, would later testify to investigators that she had always found Mother Lucia kind but firm, generous but exacting of obedience. She recalled that Mother Lucia personally supervised all aspects of the Magdalene house, often staying up through the night when women were in labor, personally attending births with only Sister Josephine present. She said it was to protect the poor girl's modesty, Margaret testified, that fewer witnesses to their shame was a Christian mercy. When infants died, and infant death was tragically common, Mother Lucia arranged immediate burial in the convent's small cemetery behind the chapel. Father Healy would be informed and would come to bless the small grave. The mothers, distraught with grief, would be consoled by Mother Lucia, who assured them their babies were now angels in heaven, spared the sufferings of this world. Several former residents of the Magdalene house later reported that Mother Lucia had a particular way of comforting grieving mothers. She would tell them their loss was God's will, and that accepting it without excessive mourning was proof of true faith. When adoptions were arranged, Mother Lucia handled all communications with the families. She would meet them herself, explain the child's circumstances in vague terms, accept the modest donation that was customary, and personally deliver the infant. She kept meticulous records of these placements in a separate ledger that she maintained in her private office, a room to which only she and Sister Josephine had keys. The financial structure was equally opaque. The convent survived on a combination of charitable donations, the small tuition paid by parents who could afford to send their daughters to the school, income from the laundry, and financial support from the diocese. Mother Lucia submitted annual financial reports to the bishop, showing expenses for food, fuel, building maintenance, and charity distribution. These reports were always in perfect order, balancing to the penny, showing a modest institution operating efficiently on limited resources. What no one knew, what no one had any reason to suspect, was that there was a second set of books, a complete accounting that detailed income from sources never reported to the diocese, money that came from desperate families, from certain doctors, from arrangements that existed in whispered conversations and sealed letters. Thomas Brennan, Mother Lucia's younger brother, worked as a clerk at the Boston Custom House. He had access to shipping manifests, immigration records, and information about newly arrived Irish families. He would identify families with resources, those who had managed to bring some money from Ireland, those with relatives already established in Boston. He would note particularly desperate situations: young women traveling alone, families with pregnant daughters, widows with children born out of wedlock. This information would make its way to Mother Lucia. She would then arrange, through seemingly chance encounters facilitated by sympathetic Catholic laypeople, for these families to learn about St. Brigid's Magdalene house. The convent's reputation for discretion and mercy was genuine, built on real charitable work, which made it the perfect cover for something darker. Catherine Walsh, who had worked briefly at the convent in 1844 as a cook, later told investigators about a conversation she'd overheard between Mother Lucia and a well-dressed woman she didn't recognize. The woman was crying, Catherine testified. She kept saying, "We have the money, but it must never be known." Mother Lucia held her hands and said, "God's mercy is infinite, and his servants know how to be discreet." The woman gave her an envelope. "I saw it was very thick." Mother Lucia put it on her desk without counting it. When investigators later found Mother Lucia's hidden ledger, they discovered that this unnamed woman had paid $200, more than a year's wages for a laborer. for services that were never specified in writing but were understood by both parties. The children who died were real, but not all the deaths recorded in the official registry had actually occurred. Some of those deceased infants had been sold to families willing to pay premium prices for complete discretion and forged documentation that would allow them to claim the children as their own biological offspring. Mother Lucia had connections with a doctor, James Alton, who maintained a practice in a respectable neighborhood and who would, for appropriate compensation, sign birth certificates listing wealthy Protestant couples as parents of children who were actually born to Irish Catholic girls at St. Brigid's. Dr. Alton would later attempt to defend his actions by claiming he believed he was helping childless couples while securing futures for children who would otherwise grow up in poverty. But the financial records told a different story. He had received over $3,000 in payments from Mother Lucia between 1840 and 1847, a fortune that suggested something far more systematic than occasional acts of questionable charity. The young women who took vows as lay sisters, 14 of them, according to the official records, were real. But what wasn't recorded was how that decision was presented to them. Several survivors would later testify that after giving birth, they were told their children had died. Overcome with grief, isolated from their families, these women saw no future beyond the convent walls. Mother Lucia would comfort them, suggesting that perhaps God was calling them to consecrated life, that service to others might heal their wounded hearts. She would paint a picture of lifelong security, community, and purpose. For women who had lost everything, including their children, it seemed like the only path forward. But not all the children had died. Some had been adopted out without the mother's knowledge. They would spend the rest of their lives believing their babies were buried in the small cemetery behind the chapel, never knowing their children were alive, growing up in Protestant households under assumed names. This system operated smoothly for years because everyone involved believed they understood what was happening, but each person's understanding was carefully limited to their role. The sisters thought they were serving a well-run charity. The diocese thought they were funding a model institution. The desperate families thought they were receiving Catholic mercy. The wealthy families thought they were participating in discreet but legal adoptions. Only Mother Lucia and Sister Josephine saw the complete picture. Only they knew which babies had truly died, which had been adopted legally, which had been sold with forged documents, and which mothers had been deceived. Only they knew where all the money went, where all the bodies were buried, and how to maintain the elaborate fiction that held it all together. And they might have maintained it indefinitely if Sister Agnes hadn't asked the wrong questions. Sister Agnes's first months at St. Brigid's were unremarkable. She attended dawn prayers at 5 o'clock, worked in the kitchen preparing meals for the sisters and the students, spent 2 hours each afternoon helping the younger girls with their catechism, and retired to her small cell each night after evening prayers at 8. She wrote weekly letters to her mother and siblings, carefully preserving the postage money Mother Lucia provided for that purpose, describing her days in terms that suggested contentment if not joy. But Agnes was observant in ways that served her poorly. She noticed patterns, she remembered details, and she possessed a quality that would ultimately seal her fate. She could not accept explanations that contradicted her observations. The first incident occurred on January 8, 1847, approximately 2 months after her arrival. Agnes had been assigned to help in the laundry that day, working alongside Margaret Sullivan. As they sorted sheets in the convent's basement laundry room, Agnes noticed something unusual. Several sets of very small garments, intricately embroidered with initials and decorative patterns far too expensive for the typical residents of the Magdalene house. "Those are lovely," Agnes remarked to Margaret. "I didn't know the mothers here had access to such fine needlework." Margaret glanced at the garments and shook her head. "Those don't belong to anyone here, dear. Sometimes Mother Lucia receives donations of baby clothes from wealthy Catholic families. She keeps them for special occasions, baptisms where the poor babies should look their best." Agnes nodded but found herself troubled. The initials embroidered on the garments, JBP, MRF, TWH, suggested they had been custom-made for specific children. Why would wealthy families donate such personal items? And baptisms were typically performed within days of birth. Why would these clothes be in the laundry, being washed if they were stored for future use? She said nothing, but she noticed. The second incident followed just 2 weeks later. On the night of January 24th, Agnes woke to the sound of quiet movement in the hallway outside her cell. The convent maintained strict silence after evening prayers, and the sisters' cells were on the third floor, far from the Magdalene house on the second floor where such nighttime activity might be expected during a difficult labor. Agnes rose and opened her door slightly, peering into the dimly lit corridor. She saw Sister Josephine and another figure, partially obscured by shadow, carrying something wrapped in cloth down the back stairs. The bundle was small, approximately the size that would accommodate an infant. Agnes heard a sound. It might have been a muffled cry, or it might have been the creak of old wood. She couldn't be certain. In the morning, at breakfast, Agnes carefully asked Sister Martha, one of the older nuns who supervised the school, whether anyone in the Magdalene house had given birth during the night. Sister Martha looked surprised. "Not that I'm aware of, dear. Why do you ask?" "I thought I heard movement," Agnes said carefully. "I wondered if someone needed help." "If there had been a birth, Mother Lucia would have summoned the necessary sisters," Sister Martha replied. "You should focus on your prayer and your work, not on sounds in the night. Old buildings make many noises, especially in winter." It was a reasonable explanation. Agnes accepted it, but again she noticed. The third incident occurred on February 12th, and it troubled Agnes far more deeply. She had been helping Sister Josephine organize the chapel vestments when she accidentally knocked over a small wooden box stored on a high shelf in the sacristy. The box fell open, spilling its contents across the floor. Several pieces of correspondence, all addressed to Mother Lucia, all from the same sender, Dr. James Alton. Agnes gathered them quickly, meaning to return them to the box without reading private correspondence. But as she picked up one letter, her eye caught a phrase that stopped her. "The arrangement you propose is acceptable. The family in question has agreed to the sum of $200, and I have prepared the documentation as discussed. The birth will be registered for March 3rd. Agnes froze. Why would a doctor be discussing financial arrangements with Mother Lucia? Why would birth dates be decided in advance? Before she could read further, Sister Josephine returned to the sacristy. "Sister Agnes, what are you doing with those letters?" "I'm so sorry, sister. I accidentally knocked the box down. I was just gathering everything up." Sister Josephine's face was calm, but her eyes were hard. She took the letters from Agnes's hands and returned them to the box without comment. Then she turned to Agnes and spoke quietly. "Private correspondence is precisely that, sister. You will not speak of anything you may have glimpsed. Do you understand?" "Yes, sister, I'm sorry." Mother Lucia maintains many charitable relationships that require discretion. Families in difficult circumstances must be protected. Surely you understand that? "Of course, sister." Sister Josephine studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, we will not speak of this again." But that night Agnes lay awake in her cell, troubled by questions she couldn't silence. Charitable relationships that required discretion. Documentation prepared in advance. Specific sums of money. None of it quite made sense, but none of it was explicitly wrong either. She told herself she was being suspicious without cause, that her imagination was conjuring problems where none existed. The fourth incident shattered that fragile rationalization. On February 28, 1847, Agnes encountered a young woman in the convent's small garden behind the chapel. The woman was perhaps 20 years old, thin to the point of illness, with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. She was clearly one of the residents from the Magdalene house, though Agnes had never seen her before. "God bless you, sister," the woman said quietly. "And you," Agnes replied. "I'm Sister Agnes. Are you well?" The woman laughed, a sound without humor. "Well, I suppose I'm alive if that's what you mean. Can I help you in some way?" The woman looked at Agnes for a long moment, seeming to measure something. Then she spoke quickly, her voice low and urgent. "My baby. They told me she died 3 weeks ago, but I heard her crying last night. I heard my baby crying." Agnes felt cold spread through her chest. I'm certain you're mistaken. Grief can make us imagine." "I know my baby's cry." The woman's voice rose sharply. "I carried her for 9 months. I heard her scream when she was born. I held her for 2 days before they said she was sick. And last night I heard her crying somewhere in this building. I heard my baby." "Please calm yourself," Agnes said, glancing around nervously. "Perhaps you should speak with Mother Lucia." "Mother Lucia told me herself. She said my baby died of lung fever. She said she was buried already, that it was better I didn't see the body. But I heard from her last night. They told me she was dead, but she's alive somewhere in this place." Before Agnes could respond, Sister Josephine appeared in the garden doorway. Her face was serene, but there was steel in her voice. "Mary Frances, you should be resting. Come with me." The young woman, Mary Frances, looked at Agnes with desperate, pleading eyes. Tell someone, please, my baby didn't die. I know she didn't die. Sister Josephine took Mary Frances firmly by the arm and led her back toward the Magdalene house. Agnes stood alone in the garden, her heart pounding, her mind racing with implications she didn't want to face. That evening, Agnes broke the rule of silence. She went to Mother Lucia's office and requested an audience. Mother Lucia received her with her customary warmth, gesturing for Agnes to sit. "What troubles you, my dear?" Agnes chose her words carefully. "I encountered one of the women from the Magdalene house today, Mary Frances. She seemed very distressed. She said she believes her baby didn't die." Mother Lucia's expression remained perfectly calm, but something flickered in her eyes. "Ah, yes, poor Mary Frances. She's had a very difficult time. The death of her child has affected her mind. It's not uncommon, I'm sad to say. The grief of these poor women can manifest in terrible delusions. She said she heard her baby crying. The mind plays cruel tricks when the heart is broken," Mother Lucia said gently. "We have several infants in our care at any given time. Mary Frances likely heard one of them and in her grief imagined it was her own child. It's tragic, really. We're praying for her recovery. Would it be possible for me to help care for her, to provide some comfort?" Mother Lucia smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's very charitable of you, Sister Agnes. But Mary Frances requires specialized care that you're not yet trained to provide. Sister Josephine has extensive experience with such cases. It's best if Mary Frances has limited interaction with others while she recovers. Too much attention sometimes reinforces these delusions rather than helping the person move past them." Agnes nodded slowly. It was a reasonable explanation. Everything Mother Lucia said was reasonable, and yet. "Was there anything else troubling you?" Mother Lucia asked. Agnes hesitated, then spoke. "I've noticed, forgive me, Mother, but I've noticed some things that seem unusual. Baby clothes that appear very expensive. Correspondence about financial arrangements, and now Mary Frances's claims. I'm not suggesting anything improper, but I find myself confused." Mother Lucia's expression became very serious. She rose from her desk and moved to sit beside Agnes, taking her hand in a maternal gesture. "My dear child, I want you to understand something very important. The work we do here is complicated. We serve the poorest of the poor, yes, but we also serve wealthy families who face their own kinds of suffering, the suffering of childlessness, of scandals that must be managed discreetly. We operate in spaces between the official and the necessary. Does that make sense?" I'm not certain. The Church teaches us that mercy sometimes requires flexibility. When a wealthy Protestant family wishes to adopt a Catholic child, should we refuse them because the law makes such adoptions difficult? Should we condemn an innocent baby to an orphanage because of bureaucratic complications? Or should we, in our charity, find ways to place children in good homes, even if the process is not entirely conventional? "But is that legal?" Agnes asked quietly. Mother Lucia squeezed her hand. "Legality and morality are not always identical, Sister Agnes. Slavery is legal in the southern states. Is it therefore moral? The British authorities who allow Irish children to starve are acting within their legal rights. Does that make them righteous? Sometimes God calls us to a higher law, the law of mercy, of compassion, of doing whatever is necessary to protect the innocent." It was a sophisticated argument. Agnes felt herself wavering, wanting to believe, wanting to accept this explanation that would allow her to stop questioning. "As for Mary Frances," Mother Lucia continued, "her baby truly did die. It breaks my heart, but infant mortality is a terrible reality we face constantly. Some mothers cannot accept it. They create fantasies to protect themselves from unbearable pain. Our mercy toward them includes not forcing them to confront truths they cannot yet bear. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mother," Agnes whispered, but she didn't understand, not really. And in her private prayers that night, Agnes begged God for clarity, for the strength to trust her superiors, for the quieting of doubts that felt like temptations of the devil. God's answer would come in a form she never expected. I need to pause here because what happens next, what Sister Agnes discovered in the days following that conversation, represents a turning point not just in this story, but in how we understand institutional corruption. If you're watching this, you're about to witness how one young woman's inability to accept comfortable lies led her to uncover a system of evil that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Before we continue, I want to ask you to do something. If this story is affecting you, if you're feeling that particular kind of dread that comes from recognizing patterns, from seeing how easily good people can be deceived, from understanding how authority and trust can be weaponized, Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to someone who still believes that institutions will police themselves, that respected authorities can be trusted simply because of their positions. This is not ancient history. This happened in America in a major city within living memory of the Civil War. The systems that enabled what happened at St. Brigid's Convent, the compartmentalization of information, the exploitation of vulnerable populations, the use of charity as cover for criminal activity, the silencing of victims through gaslighting and institutional authority, these systems still exist. They exist in every institution that operates behind closed doors and demands unquestioning obedience. Drop a comment if you're still watching. Tell me if you've ever encountered situations where something felt wrong, but everyone around you insisted everything was fine. Tell me about times when you questioned authority and were told you were being disrespectful or paranoid. Because that's what this story is really about, the courage it takes to trust your own perception when everyone else is telling you you're wrong. Just when we thought Sister Agnes would accept Mother Lucia's explanations and settle back into quiet obedience, she did something that sealed her fate. She stopped trusting what she was told and started trusting what she could see. And what she saw in the early hours of March 13th, 1847, would haunt her for the 6 remaining days of her life. Sister Agnes couldn't sleep on the night of March 12th, 1847. It wasn't unusual. She had struggled with insomnia since childhood, but this particular sleeplessness felt different, charged with an anxiety she couldn't name. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, she rose from her narrow bed, wrapped herself in her gray woolen shawl, and decided to go to the chapel to pray. The convent was silent as Agnes descended the back staircase from the 3rd floor. She carried no candle. The moon was bright enough to illuminate her path, and she knew the building's geography by heart after 4 months of residence. As she reached the ground floor and turned toward the corridor that led to the chapel, she heard voices. They came from the direction of Mother Lucia's office, low and urgent. Agnes froze, uncertain whether to proceed or retreat. The conversation became clearer as she stood motionless in the shadows. "Cannot continue like this." It was a man's voice, cultured and educated. Agnes recognized it, Dr. James Alton. "The risks are becoming unacceptable." That last family had questions about the documentation. "I managed it." Mother Lucia's voice was calm, controlled. "They wanted a child badly enough not to investigate too carefully." "That's precisely the problem." The doctor's voice rose slightly before he caught himself. "Eventually someone will investigate. Eventually someone will notice the pattern. There are only so many deaths and adoptions a single institution can process before." "Before what?" Mother Lucia interrupted. "Before the diocese questions the finances I've been successfully managing for 9 years. Before the civil authorities develop a sudden interest in what happens to Irish Catholic babies." "You're being paranoid, James." $320. The doctor's voice was tight. "That's what we've made in the past 6 weeks alone. The Whitmore family, the Prescotts, that textile merchant whose name you won't tell me. Don't you see how suspicious this looks on paper?" "Which is why we're so careful about the paper," Mother Lucia said. Agnes could hear the sound of footsteps as if the Mother Superior was pacing. "The official registry shows natural deaths and legitimate adoptions. The real accounting is known only to us, as long as we maintain that separation." "And the mothers, what about Mary Frances?" "She's telling anyone who will listen that her child is still alive. Mary Frances's ravings are the product of a disturbed mind. No one takes them seriously. Sister Josephine has been administering her medication." Agnes pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. Medication? They were drugging Mary Frances. That explained her hollow eyes, her confusion, the way she had seemed both desperate and disoriented in the garden. "And what about the bodies?" Dr. Alton asked. "The crypt is secure, has been secure for years, and will remain secure," Mother Lucia said sharply. "No one goes down there except Sister Josephine and myself. The entrance is kept locked. Father Donovan has no reason to ever descend those steps." Agnes felt ice spreading through her veins. Bodies, a crypt, a locked entrance. She thought of the small cemetery behind the chapel, where tiny crosses marked the graves of infants who had supposedly died and been quickly buried. But if there were bodies in the crypt? The conversation in the office shifted to logistical details, names of contacts, dates of upcoming arrangements, amounts of money. Agnes couldn't process most of it through the roaring in her ears. She needed to leave before she was discovered, but her limbs felt paralyzed by horror and disbelief. Finally, she heard the sound of chairs moving, indicating the meeting was concluding. Agnes retreated quickly, silently back up the stairs to her cell. She did not sleep again that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what she'd heard with any benign interpretation. Trying desperately to find an explanation that didn't lead to the monstrous conclusion her mind kept reaching. By morning prayers, she had made her decision. She would go to Father Healy. She would tell him everything she'd observed, everything she'd heard. He was the pastor of the parish, the ecclesiastical authority over the convent. He would know what to do, he would investigate, he would protect her. But first she needed proof. Father Healy would need more than the suspicions and overheard conversation of a 19-year-old postulant who had been at the convent less than 5 months. She needed to see the crypt with her own eyes. The entrance to the crypt was located inside the chapel, behind the altar, concealed by a heavy wooden panel that was carved to match the surrounding wall. Agnes had noticed it before but had never seen it opened. According to the other sisters, it contained old vestments, damaged prayer books, and other items too worn for use but too sacred for casual disposal. On March 13th, after the evening meal but before evening prayers, Agnes slipped into the empty chapel. Her hands were shaking as she approached the panel behind the altar. She ran her fingers along its edges, searching for the mechanism that would open it. After several minutes, she found a small wooden catch, cleverly concealed in the carved decorations. She pressed it and the panel swung inward, revealing darkness and stone steps leading down. Agnes had brought a small candle stub she'd hidden in her pocket. She lit it with trembling hands, held it before her, and descended into the crypt. The stairs were narrow and steep, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the chapel. The air grew cold and damp as Agnes descended, and the candle's flame flickered wildly, casting monstrous shadows on the stone walls. After perhaps 15 steps, the staircase opened into a chamber approximately 12 feet square, with a ceiling so low Agnes had to duck slightly to stand upright. What she saw in that guttering candlelight would haunt Father Donovan 6 days later, but its impact on Sister Agnes was immediate and devastating. The 17 wooden crates were arranged in neat rows, each labeled with Latin text that Agnes, with her education, could read. But these were not sacred verses, they were names and dates. Infantis Maria Catharina Walsh, Natus et Mortus 15 Aprilis 1843 Infantis Thomas Brendan O'Connor, Natus et Mortus 22 Iunius 1844. Child Mary Catherine Walsh, born and died April 15, 1843. Child Thomas Brendan O'Connor, born and died June 22, 1844. Agnes moved to the nearest crate with wooden slats that allowed glimpses of the interior. She raised her candle. Through the gaps, she could see the edge of white linen and something small and still wrapped within it. Her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the candle, Agnes set it carefully on the floor and tried to lift the lid of the crate. It wasn't nailed shut, just fitted tightly into place. The lid rose with a faint creak. Agnes looked inside and immediately turned away, her stomach heaving. She vomited on the stone floor, the sound echoing in the confined space, her whole body convulsing with horror and disbelief. Inside the linen wrapping was an infant, perfectly preserved. Whether by the crypt's constant temperature or by some chemical treatment, Agnes didn't know and couldn't bear to examine closely enough to determine. The baby looked as if it were merely sleeping, but the waxy quality of the skin, the absolute stillness, left no doubt that this child had been dead for years. Agnes forced herself to look at other crates. Some were larger, clearly containing older children or even adults. Most were small, infant-sized. She counted 17 in total. And beside them, on a small wooden table that might once have held liturgical items, sat the leather-bound ledger Father Donovan would later discover. Agnes lifted the ledger with shaking hands and carried it to where her candle still burned. She opened it and began to read. What she found was a complete accounting of death, methodical, detailed, clinical. Each entry described a death. Date, time, cause, witnesses present, and method of preservation. But interspersed with genuine deaths from illness or natural causes were others that made Agnes's blood turn cold. March 8, 1842, infant male, born to Catherine Murphy. The child showed signs of facial deformity that would make placement impossible. Discontinued feeding at 8 hours post-birth. Death occurred 23 hours later. Preserved using standard methods. Mother informed the child died of respiratory failure. Accepted explanation with appropriate grief. January 15, 1844, infant female, born to Sarah Collins. Mother developed childbed fever and became delirious. The child was healthy, but the mother's death complicated placement options. Administered concentrated laudanum at 48 hours post-birth. Death occurred within 2 hours, preserved. Registered as death from failure to thrive. June 3, 1845, Margaret Ann Doyle, age 27, resident of Magdalene House. Witnessed Dr. Alton forging birth certificate for Prescott adoption. Became hysterical, threatened to report to civil authorities. Administered arsenic in evening medication. Death occurred over 3-day period, symptoms consistent with gastric illness. Buried in Convent cemetery with full rites. Doctor listed cause as acute gastroenteritis. Agnes read entry after entry, each one more horrifying than the last. The ledger documented 11 infant deaths that were clearly murders, babies killed because they were imperfect, because they were inconvenient, because circumstances made their sale impossible. 4 women were listed, residents of the Magdalene House, who had apparently learned too much or threatened exposure, all dead from various causes that the ledger revealed to be poison. But it was the final section of the ledger that made Agnes understand the true scope of what she'd discovered. It was a financial accounting, payments received, amounts paid to Dr. Alton for his services, sums sent elsewhere. The total documented income exceeded $5,000 over 7 years, a fortune that bore no relationship to the modest donations and fees recorded in the convent's official books. The final entry in the ledger, dated March 10th, just 3 days earlier, read, "The situation with Mary Frances Sullivan grows problematic. Increased medication has produced desired stupefaction, but she continues to speak of her child to anyone who will listen. More permanent solution may become necessary. Will consult with Sister Josephine regarding timeline and method." Agnes closed the ledger, her decision crystallizing with terrible clarity. She couldn't go to Father Healy with this. She couldn't risk Mother Lucia being warned, couldn't risk the evidence being destroyed. She needed to go directly to the civil authorities, to the police, to the courts, to someone outside the Catholic institutional structure that might protect one of its own. She tucked the ledger under her shawl and moved to leave the crypt. As she reached for her candle, she heard a sound from above, the creak of the chapel door opening, footsteps on the stone floor above her head. Agnes extinguished her candle immediately, plunging herself into absolute darkness. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the crypt and held her breath, praying desperately that whoever had entered the chapel would not discover the open panel, would not descend the stairs. The footsteps moved around the chapel for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then came a sound that stopped Agnes's heart, the distinctive creak of the panel behind the altar being opened wider. "Sister Agnes," it was Sister Josephine's voice, calm and patient, echoing down the stone steps. "I know you're down there, dear. I saw you enter the chapel. Why don't you come up and we can discuss whatever concerns you might have?" Agnes said nothing, didn't move, barely breathed. "I've been watching you, you know," Sister Josephine continued conversationally. "Mother Lucia thought I was being paranoid, but I knew you were trouble from the moment you started asking questions. Clever girls like you, girls who notice things, who can't accept simple explanations, you're dangerous. But we've dealt with dangerous girls before." Agnes felt for the edge of the wooden table in the darkness, found it, and silently moved in the opposite direction, toward the far wall of the crypt, away from the stairs. "The ledger isn't there anymore, is it?" Sister Josephine said. "That's what you came for, that's what you have under your shawl. You think you're going to take it to the police, don't you? You think they'll believe you? A 19-year-old Irish girl, a postulant with no standing, accusing a mother superior who's been serving this community for 9 years. Agnes's back hit the far wall. She was trapped. The only exit was the staircase where Sister Josephine stood. "Let me tell you what will happen if you try," Sister Josephine said, and Agnes could hear her beginning to descend the steps. "The police will come. They'll speak with Mother Lucia, who will be shocked and saddened by your accusations. She'll explain that you've been troubled since arriving, that you've shown signs of mental instability, that she's been concerned about your welfare. She'll show them the official registry, all perfectly documented. She'll introduce them to Father Healy, who will attest to her character. And they'll look at you, poor, foreign, Catholic female, and they'll believe her." The footsteps grew closer. Agnes could see the faint glow of a lantern descending the stairs. "But it won't come to that," Sister Josephine said, "because you're going to give me that ledger, and then we're going to go back upstairs and discuss this rationally. Mother Lucia can be very understanding. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps what you read could be interpreted differently. Perhaps." Agnes made her decision in that instant. She clutched the ledger tight to her chest and screamed at the top of her lungs, "Help, help me, someone help." The acoustics of the stone crypt amplified her voice, sending it echoing up the stairway and into the chapel above. Sister Josephine lunged forward with surprising speed for a woman of 60 years, but Agnes dodged to the side, stumbling over one of the crates. "You stupid girl." Sister Josephine's calm facade cracked, revealing fury beneath. "You stupid, stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Agnes scrambled toward the stairs, still screaming for help. She made it halfway up before she felt Sister Josephine's hand close around her ankle, yanking her backward. Agnes fell hard on the stone steps, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs and sending the ledger tumbling from her hands, bouncing down the steps into the darkness below. "No," Agnes gasped, trying to pull herself up despite Sister Josephine's grip. Then she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, voices from above, multiple voices calling out in alarm. "Who's down there? What's happening?" That sounded like Sister Agnes. "Someone get Mother Lucia." Sister Josephine released Agnes's ankle and retreated down the stairs into the crypt, moving to retrieve the fallen ledger. Agnes pulled herself up and continued climbing, emerging into the chapel where three sisters stood in confusion and alarm. Sisters Martha, Teresa, and Catherine, who had been in the refectory and heard Agnes's screams through the walls. "Sister Agnes, what on earth?" "Get Father Healy," Agnes gasped out, her whole body shaking. "Get Father Healy now, and don't let anyone go down those stairs, no one. Stand here and make sure no one goes down." "But what?" "Now," Agnes screamed with an authority that shocked them all. "Get him now and tell him lives depend on it. Tell him Sister Agnes says there are bodies in the crypt and he needs to come immediately." The three sisters stared at her in shock. Then Sister Martha, the eldest, seemed to see something in Agnes's face that convinced her. "Catherine, go, run to the rectory, bring Father Healy, now." As Sister Catherine fled, Agnes collapsed on the chapel floor, gasping for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. Sister Martha knelt beside her while Sister Teresa stood guard at the open panel, staring down into the darkness below. 15 minutes later, Father Healy arrived at a run, his cassock flying behind him, his face flushed from exertion. "Sister Agnes, what is this about?" Catherine said. "There are bodies in the crypt, Father," Agnes said, her voice now eerily calm with shock. 17 of them, children and women, and there's a ledger that documents murders. Sister Josephine is down there. She knows what I found. She tried to stop me." Father Healy stared at her, his face reflecting disbelief and dawning horror. He moved to the opening and called down, "Sister Josephine, are you there? Come up immediately." No response came from the darkness below. Father Healy looked at the assembled sisters, then back at Agnes. "Stay here, all of you, don't move." Then he descended the stairs. What Father Healy saw in those next minutes would change everything. He returned 15 minutes later, his face gray, his hands shaking, carrying the leather-bound ledger. Sister Josephine followed behind him, her expression now completely blank, showing no emotion whatsoever. "Send for the police," Father Healy said quietly, "and send for the bishop. Tell them ... tell them there's been a crime. Multiple crimes, tell them." He trailed off, looking at the ledger in his hands as if it were a poisonous snake. Agnes began to cry, great, gasping sobs of relief and horror and delayed terror. Sister Martha held her while the convent erupted into chaos around them. Mother Lucia was found in her office, calmly burning papers in her fireplace. She was arrested within the hour. Sister Agnes had uncovered the truth. But the price of that discovery would prove higher than anyone could have imagined. The Boston police arrived at St. Brigid's Convent at approximately 9 o'clock on the evening of March 13, 1847. Captain William Harrison, a Protestant who harbored no particular love for Catholic institutions, but who prided himself on professional thoroughness, took command of the scene. What followed was an investigation that would eventually involve the mayor's office, the district attorney, and reluctant cooperation from the Boston Archdiocese. The initial examination of the crypt confirmed Agnes's report in its essentials. 17 wooden crates containing human remains, meticulously preserved and labeled. A ledger documenting deaths, financial transactions, and damning details that pointed toward systematic murder and criminal conspiracy. Physical evidence of chemical preservatives consistent with arsenic and mercury compounds used in medical preservation. Though these same chemicals, investigators would note grimly, could also be used for poisoning. Dr. Jonas Kimball, the county coroner, was summoned at dawn on March 14th to examine the remains. His official report, preserved in the Suffolk County Archives, makes for grim reading. Of the 17 bodies, he determined that at least 8 infants showed signs of deliberate starvation, identifiable by specific patterns of tissue deterioration. 3 infants showed evidence of what he termed chemical intervention, traces of compounds consistent with deliberate poisoning. 2 adult female bodies showed similar signs of arsenic poisoning. with characteristic damage to internal organs still visible despite preservation. The other 4 infant bodies and 2 adult bodies appeared to have died from natural causes, genuine illness, complications of birth, or in one case, an elderly sister who had died at age 78 from what appeared to be heart failure. These natural deaths, investigators realized, had been preserved alongside the murders to pad the numbers, to make the horrific death count seem like natural mortality rather than systematic killing. But it was the ledger that provided the roadmap to the broader conspiracy. Mother Lucia had kept immaculate records, perhaps from a twisted sense of order, perhaps as insurance against her accomplices, or perhaps, as some psychologists would later theorize, from a desire to document and justify her actions, even if only to herself. The ledger revealed a network involving at least 6 accomplices. Dr. James Alton had provided medical services including forging birth certificates, examining babies to determine their marketability, and supplying poisons disguised as medications. He had received over $1,200 in documented payments. Thomas Brennan, Mother Lucia's brother, had identified vulnerable families and provided information that allowed Mother Lucia to target specific clients. He had received at least $800. Sister Josephine Maguire had assisted in the murders directly, administering poisons, helping to move bodies, and managing the day-to-day deceptions. Her motivation appeared to be pure loyalty to Mother Lucia, whom she had served for nearly a decade. Attorney Charles Whitmore had prepared falsified adoption documents and had helped arrange placements with wealthy Protestant families willing to pay premium prices for absolute discretion. He had received over $600 in fees. Mrs. Sarah Pendleton, a midwife who maintained a practice in South Boston, had provided babies from other sources, women who gave birth at her establishment, and whose children were then transferred to St. Brigid's for adoption through the network. She received payments of $50 per child delivered. Father Patrick Healy was not implicated in the criminal conspiracy. The investigation cleared him completely, but it revealed a level of negligence that bordered on the criminal. He had made perfunctory visits to the convent, accepted Mother Lucia's reports without verification, and never once examined the actual conditions in the Magdalene house. His trust in Mother Lucia's piety had made him blind to warning signs that, in retrospect, should have triggered questions. The financial accounting revealed the true scope. Between 1840 and 1847, the conspiracy had generated approximately $5,400 in profit, equivalent to more than $150,000 in modern currency. Of 37 babies born at the convent during this period, 14 had been sold through the illegal adoption network, 8 had been murdered when they proved unsellable, 6 had died of natural causes, and 9 had been placed in legitimate adoptions or had survived with their mothers. But numbers only told part of the story. The investigation revealed something more disturbing: the psychological sophistication of the operation. Mary Frances Sullivan, the young mother who had insisted her baby was alive, was found to have been correct. Her daughter had not died of lung fever as Mother Lucia had claimed. The baby had been sold to a textile merchant named Horace Whitmore, brother to the attorney Charles Whitmore, and his wife Eleanor, who had paid $250 for a child they registered as their biological daughter under the name Elizabeth Whitmore. The Whitmores, when confronted by police, initially denied everything, then claimed they believed the adoption was legal, then finally admitted they had known the documentation was forged, but justified their actions by their desperate desire for a child and their belief that they could provide a better life than an Irish Catholic, unwed mother ever could. Mary Frances Sullivan, upon learning her daughter was alive, collapsed with shock and had to be hospitalized. The reunion between mother and child, which took place under court supervision on March 28, 1847, was documented by multiple witnesses as heartbreaking. The child, now 13 months old, did not recognize Mary Frances, and Mary Frances herself was so weakened by months of drugging that she could barely hold the baby. Catherine Walsh, the woman Agnes had encountered in the garden, was found to have been right as well. Her son, whom she'd been told died of failure to thrive, had actually been sold to a ship captain's family in Salem. The child was recovered and returned to Catherine, though at age 3, he had no memory of his biological mother. The investigation uncovered 3 more women who had been told their babies died when the children had actually been sold. Each reunion was supervised by city authorities, and each was documented as traumatic for both mother and child. But 4 of the mothers whose babies had been murdered could never be reunited with their children. These women, Catherine Murphy, Sarah Collins, Ann Doyle, and Margaret Riley, had been told their infants died of various natural causes. They had grieved, accepted God's will as they'd been taught, and moved forward with their shattered lives. Now they learned their babies had been deliberately killed. The psychological devastation was total and permanent. The investigation also revealed the fate of the 4 adult women documented in the ledger as murdered. 3 had been residents of the Magdalene house who had either witnessed something incriminating or had threatened to report irregularities to authorities. They had died over a 3-year period from various gastrointestinal illnesses that were actually arsenic poisoning, administered slowly to mimic natural disease. The 4th was Sister Bernadette Quinn, an elderly nun who had served at St. Brigid's for 15 years. According to testimony from other sisters, she had confronted Mother Lucia in 1845 about financial discrepancies she'd noticed in the convent accounts. She died 3 weeks later of what was recorded as heart failure. The ledger revealed it was digitalis poisoning, a substance derived from foxglove that in small doses treats heart conditions, but in larger doses causes heart failure indistinguishable from natural causes. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Mother Lucia's correspondence, much of it partially burned but still legible. Letters to potential clients were masterpieces of coded language. A child blessed by God and in need of Christian parents meant a healthy, light-skinned baby suitable for sale to Protestant families. A child marked by suffering meant one with visible deformities that made sale impossible. Arrangements requiring the utmost discretion meant illegal placements with forged documents. One letter, written to a wealthy merchant in February 1846, read, "The child you inquired about is indeed available. She is fair of complexion, healthy in constitution, and of the female sex as you specified. The customary donation of $200 will ensure all documentation is properly arranged. Your family's privacy is, as always, my paramount concern." The investigation revealed that Mother Lucia's motivation was not primarily financial, though she had certainly profited. Deeper psychological currents were at work. In her own writings, found in a private journal separate from the ledger, Mother Lucia had constructed an elaborate theological justification for her actions. She wrote of purifying the race by removing defective children who would only suffer in life. She wrote of God's efficiency in using the deaths of flawed infants to fund charity for the worthy poor. She wrote of Protestant families as instruments of God's providence, who could give Catholic children better lives than their biological mothers ever could. And she wrote of herself as engaged in a form of necessary mercy, killing infants who would otherwise suffer, while enriching the convent's ability to serve the deserving. It was a twisted philosophy, but internally consistent and rooted in genuine religious conviction, however perverted. Mother Lucia apparently believed she was doing God's work, that the murders were acts of compassion, that the deceptions were justified by the greater good they enabled. This perhaps made her more dangerous than a simple criminal. She had convinced herself she was righteous. The investigation also exposed failures at multiple institutional levels. The diocese had never conducted thorough audits of the convent's finances. The civil authorities had never inspected the Magdalene house despite periodic rumors of mistreatment. The medical community had not questioned Dr. Altan's unusual number of forged certificates. The legal profession had not investigated Attorney Whitmore's suspicious adoption paperwork. Everyone had assumed someone else was providing oversight. Everyone had trusted that a Catholic institution run by nuns would police itself. Everyone had been wrong. Mother Lucia was arrested on the evening of March 13th without resistance. Captain Harrison later testified that she seemed almost relieved when he arrived, as though she'd been expecting this moment for years. She was found in her office, calmly burning documents in her fireplace, correspondence, financial records, letters from clients. Much was destroyed, but enough survived to build a comprehensive case. Her first words to Captain Harrison, according to his official report, were, "I suppose Sister Agnes told you everything. That girl never could keep silent when silence was wisdom." She was taken to the Boston City Jail and held without bail. The following morning, Dr. James Altan was arrested at his home. Unlike Mother Lucia, he collapsed completely, weeping and protesting that he'd only wanted to help childless families, that he'd never intended any harm, that he'd been manipulated by Mother Lucia's stronger will. His attorney would later attempt to portray him as a victim of sorts, a weak man dominated by a formidable woman. But the financial records made clear he'd been a willing and profitable participant. Thomas Brennan fled Boston on March 14th, apparently warned by an unknown Confederate that arrests were underway. He made it as far as New York City before being apprehended on March 20th. He was returned to Boston in chains, protesting his innocence and claiming he'd only provided information, never knowing what it would be used for. Attorney Charles Whitmore was arrested on March 16th. He immediately hired the best legal representation money could buy and refused to make any statements whatsoever. His strategy would be to challenge the legality of the evidence, question the credibility of witnesses, and delay proceedings as long as possible. Sister Josephine Maguire was arrested the same night as Mother Lucia. Her response to arrest was perhaps the most disturbing of all the conspirators. She showed no emotion whatsoever. When Captain Harrison informed her she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, she replied simply, "I did what Mother Lucia required. I have always done what Mother Lucia required. I regret nothing except that we were discovered." Mrs. Sarah Pendleton was arrested on March 17th at her midwifery practice. She initially denied everything, then attempted to negotiate by offering to testify against the others in exchange for leniency. When investigators made clear they had sufficient evidence without her cooperation, she became hostile and declared that she'd only provided a service that was desperately needed, placing unwanted babies with families who wanted them. "Those Irish girls didn't want their bastards," she told investigators. "I gave their children good homes. I should be thanked, not arrested." The public confrontation that would dominate newspaper coverage occurred on April 3, 1847, when Mother Lucia was formally arraigned before Judge Samuel Whitman in the Suffolk County Court. The courtroom was packed with spectators, both Catholic supporters who couldn't believe the charges and Protestant observers who saw the case as confirmation of their prejudices against Catholic institutions. Mother Lucia entered the courtroom in her religious habit, her bearing erect and dignified. She had refused to remove her veil, claiming religious freedom, and the judge had allowed it. When asked to enter a plea, she rose and spoke in a clear, calm voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. "I plead not guilty to these charges," she said. "But more than that, I reject the authority of this court to judge actions taken in service to God. You do not understand what you're condemning. You see murder where there was mercy. You see crime where there was compassion. Those infants who died by my hand were spared lives of suffering and deformity. Those mothers who grieve now would have watched their children starve or sicken or live as objects of mockery. I gave those babies peace, and I gave their mothers the dignity of believing God had taken them naturally." The courtroom erupted in shouts and gasps. Judge Whitman hammered for order. Mother Lucia continued, her voice rising. "And those children I placed with Protestant families, you call that criminal? They live now in comfort and security their Catholic mothers could never have provided. They will be educated, cared for, given opportunities that being the bastards of Irish immigrants would have denied them. I facilitated God's providence, nothing more." "That is quite enough," Judge Whitman declared. "You will have the opportunity to present your defense at trial. Your plea of not guilty is entered." As she was led from the courtroom, Mother Lucia turned and looked directly at Sister Agnes, who sat in the front row of the gallery. Their eyes met for a long moment. Then Mother Lucia smiled, a small, sad smile that contained no remorse, and said loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "You thought you were saving them, didn't you, child? You'll learn. You'll learn that mercy sometimes wears the face of cruelty, and cruelty the face of justice." Agnes would later tell investigators that those words haunted her more than anything else. The absolute conviction in Mother Lucia's voice, the genuine belief that her actions had been righteous. It was one thing to uncover evil that knew itself to be evil. It was far more disturbing to confront evil that believed itself to be good. Sister Josephine's arraignment was equally chilling in its own way. She entered no plea initially, standing mute before the judge. When pressed, she finally spoke. "Whatever Mother Lucia did, I assisted. Whatever charges you bring against her, you may bring against me. I have no defense to offer because I acknowledge no wrongdoing. I served my superior as religious obedience required. If that is criminal in your eyes, then I am criminal. But in God's eyes, I am blameless." The other conspirators were less philosophically coherent. Dr. Alton pleaded not guilty but was clearly broken, weeping throughout the proceedings. Thomas Brennan pleaded not guilty and blamed everything on his sister's manipulation. Attorney Whitmore pleaded not guilty and maintained dignified silence. Mrs. Pendleton pleaded not guilty and continued to insist she provided a legitimate service. As the legal proceedings ground forward through the spring of 1847, public opinion divided sharply. Many in Boston's Catholic community initially rallied to Mother Lucia's defense, seeing the case as Protestant persecution of Catholic institutions. But as evidence became public, particularly the ledger's contents and the testimony of mothers whose children had been stolen, that support evaporated. The diocese officially condemned Mother Lucia and cooperated fully with the investigation, eager to distance itself from the scandal. Protestant observers largely saw the case as confirmation that Catholic institutions required strict civil oversight. Editorials in the Boston Daily Atlas called for mandatory government inspection of all religious institutions serving vulnerable populations. The controversy became entangled in the broader anti-Catholic sentiment that plagued mid-19th century Boston. Through it all, Sister Agnes gave her testimony to investigators, to grand juries, and eventually at trial. She recounted every suspicious incident, every overheard conversation, every troubling detail. She described the night she descended into the crypt, what she'd seen, what she'd read in the ledger. Her testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, but the strain was enormous. Agnes had entered religious life seeking peace and purpose. Instead, she'd uncovered a nightmare. She struggled with profound guilt should she have spoken up sooner. Could she have prevented deaths if she'd been less trusting of authority? The diocese offered her counseling from sympathetic priests, but Agnes found little comfort in religious consolation. The institution she'd trusted had betrayed everything she believed in. On April 15, 1847, exactly 1 month after the discovery in the crypt, Sister Agnes wrote a letter to her mother explaining that she was leaving religious life. "I entered the convent believing God called me to serve," she wrote, "but I cannot reconcile what I've learned with continued faith in religious institutions. The evil that hid behind Mother Lucia's habit has shaken my belief that the Church can be trusted to police itself. I do not know if I can remain Catholic. I do not know if I can do anything at all." She left St. Brigid's Convent on April 20, 1847, returning to live with her mother and siblings. She would never take religious vows, and less than 2 months later she would vanish completely. The trials of Mother Lucia Brennan and her conspirators began in June 1847 and would drag on for nearly 18 months. The legal proceedings were complicated by multiple factors. The novelty of prosecuting religious figures for crimes committed within their institutional authority, the challenges of proving intent in infant deaths that occurred years earlier, and the tangled questions of jurisdiction between civil and church law. Mother Lucia's trial commenced on June 14, 1847, before Judge Samuel Whitman and a jury of 12 men. All Protestant Catholics were systematically excluded from juries in Massachusetts at that time, a fact that would later be cited in appeals. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Marcus Hanson, presented a methodical case built on the ledger, testimony from victims and witnesses, and forensic evidence from Dr. Kimball's examination of the bodies. The defense, led by attorney Jonathan Prescott, no relation to the Prescott family who had purchased a baby, attempted several strategies. First, they challenged the legality of the search that had uncovered the crypt, arguing that Agnes had no authority to enter that space and that evidence obtained from an unauthorized search should be excluded. Judge Whitman ruled against this motion, finding that Agnes had legitimate access to the chapel and that the panel had not been locked or explicitly forbidden. Second, they attempted to portray Mother Lucia as a woman driven to extremes by the overwhelming suffering she witnessed daily. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological strain of managing an institution serving destitute immigrants, the trauma of watching infant after infant die from disease and malnutrition, the desperation of women with no options. The defense argued that Mother Lucia had suffered a form of moral injury that had warped her judgment. She had begun to see herself as an instrument of divine mercy, empowered to make life-and-death decisions that would spare greater suffering. Third, they challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the ledger entries. Defense experts argued that phrases like discontinued feeding could mean simply that an infant was too weak to nurse, not deliberate starvation. Administered concentrated laudanum could be interpreted as palliative care for a dying infant rather than murder. The financial arrangements, they argued, represented donations from grateful adoptive families, not payments for illegal sales. But the prosecution had Sister Agnes. Her testimony, delivered over 3 days in late June, was devastating. She described in precise detail what she had observed, what she had overheard, and what she had read in the ledger. Her credibility was unimpeachable. She had nothing to gain from her testimony and everything to lose. She had discovered the crimes at great personal risk and had reported them immediately despite enormous pressure to remain silent. More damning still were the testimonies of the mothers. Mary Frances Sullivan described how she'd been told her daughter died of lung fever, how she'd been drugged into stupefaction when she insisted she could hear her baby crying, how she'd been treated as mentally unstable for refusing to accept a lie. Catherine Walsh testified about being told her healthy son had died of failure to thrive, about the rushed burial that prevented her from seeing the body, about the cruelty of learning years later that her child had been alive all along. On August 23, 1847, after 14 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on 8 counts of murder in the first degree, 17 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, 23 counts of fraud, and 14 counts of unlawful child trafficking. Mother Lucia showed no reaction as the verdict was read. When Judge Whitman asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she rose and spoke clearly. "I stand before you convicted but not condemned. You have been judged by human law, but I will be judged by divine law, and I am confident of my vindication before the only tribunal that matters. History will show that what you call murder was mercy, what you call crime was compassion. I pray that God forgives you for the blindness that has led to this injustice." Judge Whitman sentenced her to death by hanging, to be carried out on November 15, 1847. The sentence was controversial. Some argued that her religious status should afford some consideration, that life imprisonment would be more appropriate. Others insisted that the premeditation and scale of her crimes demanded the ultimate penalty. The Boston Catholic Diocese remained conspicuously silent on the sentencing, unwilling to either defend or condemn one of their former religious beliefs. Sister Josephine Maguire's trial followed in September 1847. She was convicted on 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Dr. James Alton was convicted on 10 counts of conspiracy to commit murder and 20 counts of fraud. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Thomas Brennan was convicted on 14 counts of conspiracy and sentenced to 20 years. Attorney Charles Whitmore was convicted on 18 counts of fraud and sentenced to 15 years. Mrs. Sarah Pendleton was convicted on 8 counts of child trafficking and sentenced to 10 years. The executions of Mother Lucia and Sister Josephine were scheduled for November 15th and November 22nd, respectively. However, both sentences were commuted to life imprisonment by Governor George Briggs, who decided that executing women, even murderous women, would set a troubling precedent. Both women were transferred to the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown, where they would spend the rest of their lives in separate cells, forbidden from communicating with each other. Mother Lucia died in prison on March 3, 1852, at age 51 of pneumonia. According to the prison chaplain who attended her final moments, she never recanted her actions or expressed remorse. Her last words were reportedly, "I did what God required. Let history judge whether I was wrong." Sister Josephine died in prison on January 17, 1859, at age 72. She had maintained silence for nearly 12 years, speaking only when absolutely necessary, spending her days in prayer. The prison records note that she never received a single visitor during her incarceration. But while the legal proceedings reached their conclusions, another tragedy was unfolding. Sister Agnes, the young woman whose courage had exposed the entire conspiracy, was unraveling. In the weeks following the trial, Agnes struggled with severe depression and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. She couldn't sleep without nightmares of the crypt, of the preserved infants, of Mother Lucia's smile in the courtroom. She couldn't pray without remembering how prayer had been used to justify murder. She couldn't attend Mass without wondering what other horrors might be hidden behind institutional facades. Her mother, Catherine O'Brien, tried desperately to help her daughter. She arranged for Agnes to see Dr. William Hammond, a progressive physician who specialized in nervous disorders. Dr. Hammond's notes, preserved in the Massachusetts Medical Society archives, describe Agnes as suffering from acute moral disturbance consequent to traumatic revelation of institutional evil, and a profound crisis of faith and trust from which recovery appears unlikely. Agnes became convinced that people were watching her, that Mother Lucia's Confederates who had escaped prosecution might seek revenge. She rarely left her mother's house. She refused to speak with reporters who sought interviews. She declined invitations to speak at reform meetings organized by activists who wanted to use her story to advocate for oversight of religious institutions. On June 19, 1847, exactly 3 months after discovering the crypt, Agnes disappeared. She left her mother's house in the early morning, telling her younger sister Margaret that she was going to the market. She never returned. Despite extensive searches by police and desperate appeals from her family, no trace of Agnes was ever found. Nobody was discovered, no witnesses reported seeing her. She had simply vanished. Theories abounded. Some believed she had been murdered by Confederates of Mother Lucia seeking revenge or silence. Others thought she had fled to escape the trauma, perhaps boarding a ship to Ireland or Canada under an assumed name. Still others speculated she had taken her own life, unable to bear the psychological burden of what she'd experienced and revealed. The official investigation concluded in September 1847 with no resolution. Agnes was listed as missing, presumed dead. Her family mourned her as another victim of St. Brigid's horror, perhaps the final victim, destroyed not by Mother Lucia directly, but by the psychological devastation of confronting institutional evil. The reforms that followed the St. Brigid scandal were significant but incomplete. The Massachusetts legislature passed the Religious Institutions Oversight Act of 1848, requiring annual inspections of any facility housing vulnerable populations, including Magdalene houses, orphanages, and asylums operated by religious organizations. The Catholic Diocese of Boston implemented new protocols for financial auditing and pastoral supervision of convents and monasteries, but the deeper implications were largely ignored. The case revealed how easily institutions could hide systematic abuse behind facades of charity. It demonstrated how authority figures could exploit trust to commit atrocities. It showed how compartmentalization of information could prevent well-meaning people from seeing patterns of criminality. Yet these systemic vulnerabilities were never adequately addressed. The 17 bodies found in the crypt were given proper burial in a section of Boston's Catholic cemetery in November 1847. After the trials concluded. A simple monument marks their grave, bearing only the inscription, "Innocents Lost to Corruption 1840 to 1847." The cemetery records list their names, but most visitors to the site have no idea of the horror that led to their premature deaths and hidden burial. St. Brigid's Convent was shuttered immediately after the discovery of the crimes. The diocese sold the property in 1849 to a private buyer who demolished the buildings and developed the land for residential housing. Nothing remains today to mark where the convent stood, where the chapel concealed its crypt of horrors, where Sister Agnes made her terrible discovery. The families who had purchased babies through the illegal adoption network faced agonizing decisions. Some voluntarily returned the children to their biological mothers, though these reunions were often traumatic for children who knew no other parents. Others fought legal battles to retain custody, arguing that years of loving care had established true parental bonds regardless of the illegal origins of the adoptions. Courts generally sided with biological mothers, but enforcement was inconsistent, and several families successfully resisted by relocating to other states. Mary Frances Sullivan was reunited with her daughter but struggled to care for her. The years of drug-induced stupefaction had damaged her health, and the trauma of learning her child had been sold had shattered her emotionally. She eventually arranged for her daughter to be raised by her own mother, Agnes's grandmother, while she worked as a domestic servant to provide financial support. She never fully recovered psychologically and died in 1867 at age 40, according to her death certificate, of consumption and melancholia. Catherine Walsh successfully reclaimed her son and eventually married a laborer named Patrick Donovan. She had 3 more children and lived until 1881. In her later years, she became an advocate for unwed mothers, speaking publicly about her experiences and arguing for legal protections against the exploitation she had suffered. The broader impact on Boston's Irish Catholic community was complex. The scandal provided ammunition for nativist elements who used it to justify their prejudices against Irish immigrants and Catholic institutions. But it also galvanized reform-minded Catholics who recognized that protecting the Church's reputation required genuine accountability rather than institutional defensiveness. Father Patrick Healy, though cleared of criminal wrongdoing, never recovered from his guilt at failing to provide adequate oversight. He resigned as pastor of St. Augustine's Church in 1848 and requested assignment to missionary work in the Western Territories. He died in California in 1856, having never returned to Boston. St. Brigid's case became a touchstone in debates about institutional accountability that continued for decades. Reformers cited it as evidence of the need for civil oversight of religious institutions. Conservative Catholics argued it was an isolated case, not representative of Catholic charities generally. Neither side fully grappled with the systemic factors that had enabled the conspiracy. The vulnerability of desperate populations, the tendency to trust authority figures without verification, and the dangers of institutions that operate behind closed doors without transparency. And Sister Agnes, the brave young woman who had trusted her own perception despite institutional pressure, who had risked everything to expose the truth, who had paid an enormous psychological price for her courage, vanished from history as completely as she had vanished from the Boston streets on that June morning in 1847. Her fate remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. But perhaps her disappearance is itself a final testimony to the terrible costs of confronting institutional evil. Even the heroes of such stories rarely survive intact. The case of Sister Agnes and St. Brigid's Convent forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and institutional behavior that remain disturbingly relevant nearly 200 years later. This was not a story of obviously evil people doing transparently wicked things. This was a story of respected figures, operating within a venerated institution, committing atrocities while convinced of their own righteousness. Mother Lucia Brennan was not born a monster. By all accounts, she began her religious life with genuine devotion and sincere desire to serve the poor. But somewhere in the years of watching desperate women arrive pregnant and terrified, watching infants die of preventable diseases, watching the endless cycle of suffering that defined Irish immigrant life in 1840s Boston, something fundamental shifted in her moral reasoning. She convinced herself that she had authority beyond ordinary limits, that she could decide which lives were worth preserving and which were better ended quickly. She convinced herself that deception in service of what she defined as the greater good was not merely acceptable but virtuous. She convinced herself that the rules binding ordinary people did not bind those who served God directly. And she built an entire philosophical system to support these convictions, a system that was internally coherent even as it was morally monstrous. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case. Mother Lucia never saw herself as a criminal. Even after arrest, conviction, and imprisonment, she maintained absolute certainty in the righteousness of her actions. She died believing history would vindicate her, that future generations would understand she had been practicing a form of harsh but necessary mercy. This capacity for self-justification, for constructing elaborate moral frameworks that redefine evil as good, is not unique to Mother Lucia. It appears repeatedly in history whenever people in positions of authority decide they are exempt from the moral limitations that bind others. It appears in every institution that operates in secret, that demands unquestioning obedience, that punishes questions as disloyalty. The secondary tragedy of this case is what it reveals about institutional complicity through negligence. Father Healy never intended harm. The diocese never authorized murders. The civil authorities never knowingly allowed child trafficking. But their collective failure to provide meaningful oversight, their willingness to trust rather than verify, their acceptance of convenient explanations for inconvenient questions, all of this created the environment in which Mother Lucia's conspiracy could flourish for nearly a decade. 17 documented murders, 23 fraudulent adoptions, multiple poisonings, the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women, the trafficking of infants. All of this happened not in some remote, isolated place, but in a major American city in a well-known institution, under the nominal supervision of religious and civil authorities. It happened because everyone assumed someone else was watching, because authority figures were trusted by virtue of their positions rather than the quality of their actions, because victims had no credible voice. And Sister Agnes. Her story is perhaps the most tragic of all. She did exactly what we're told heroes do. She saw wrong, she investigated despite personal risk, she reported what she found to authorities, she testified truthfully despite enormous pressure. And her reward was psychological destruction and likely death. She saved lives by exposing the conspiracy, but she couldn't save herself from the trauma of what she'd discovered. Her disappearance raises questions that extend beyond this single case. How many other Sister Agneses through history have tried to expose institutional evils and been destroyed in the process? How many whistleblowers have we lost because the psychological cost of confronting corruption proved unbearable? How many potential truth-tellers have remained silent because they witnessed what happened to those who spoke? The practical reforms that followed the St. Brigid scandal were important but insufficient. Inspections can be superficial. Financial audits can be manipulated. Oversight committees can be co-opted. The fundamental problem isn't lack of procedures. It's the human tendency to trust authority, to avoid uncomfortable truths, to accept convenient explanations rather than ask difficult questions. The case also reminds us that evil often wears the mask of virtue. Mother Lucia operated for years behind her religious habit and her reputation for piety. She used the language of mercy and compassion even as she committed murder. She exploited trust granted to religious authorities to prey on the vulnerable. This pattern recurs endlessly. Predators don't announce themselves as predators. They present themselves as protectors, helpers, saviors. They work within institutions we're taught to respect. They use our own trust against us. Perhaps the most important lesson from St. Brigid's Convent is this: institutional authority must never be self-validating. The claim, "Trust me because of my position," should trigger scrutiny, not acceptance. Questions should be welcomed, not punished. Transparency should be the default, not secrecy. And when someone like Sister Agnes raises concerns, the institutional response should be investigation, not defensiveness. But we've learned this lesson imperfectly at best. In the years since 1847, we've seen countless other institutional scandals, religious, governmental, educational, medical, where the same patterns appear. Authority figures exploiting trust, institutions protecting their reputations rather than their victims, whistleblowers destroyed for speaking truth, systemic reforms that address symptoms rather than causes. The bodies in the crypt beneath St. Brigid's Convent were hidden for years, but eventually discovered. How many other crypts exist that haven't yet been opened? How many other Sister Agneses are watching, noticing patterns, struggling with whether to speak? And how many will vanish, like Agnes did, destroyed by the weight of truths too terrible to bear alone? The final image that haunts this story is that moment in the courtroom when Mother Lucia looked at Sister Agnes and smiled. It was the smile of someone who remained utterly convinced of her own righteousness, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of her crimes. It was the smile of someone who believed history would vindicate her, that Agnes would eventually understand that mercy sometimes requires cruelty. She was wrong. History has not vindicated Mother Lucia Brennan. Her name is remembered, when it's remembered at all, as a cautionary tale about the corruption of institutional power and the perversion of religious authority. Her victims are memorialized, their suffering acknowledged, their stolen lives mourned. But the systems that enabled her crimes, the patterns of institutional behavior that allowed murder to masquerade as charity, the human tendencies toward blind trust and willful ignorance, those endure. Those wait for the next Mother Lucia, in the next institution, exploiting the next population of vulnerable people who have no voice and no power. And that perhaps is the real horror of St. Brigid's Convent. Not that it happened, terrible things have always happened. But that it could happen again, is happening again, will happen again, unless we learn to question authority as readily as we grant it, to protect questioners as fiercely as we respect institutions, to remember that evil most often enters through doors we've left open because we trusted the person holding the key. Sister Agnes knew that truth. It destroyed her. But her courage in speaking it saved lives. And her story, however tragic, reminds us that sometimes the only thing standing between systematic evil and its exposure is one person willing to trust their own eyes, ask uncomfortable questions, and refuse to accept convenient lies. We should remember her name: Agnes Mary Catherine O'Brien, 19 years old, postulant at St. Brigid's Convent, hero, victim, vanished June 19, 1847, gone but never forgotten. And her sacrifice demands that we remain vigilant, that we question, that we never allow institutions to operate in darkness simply because we trust they would never abuse the power we grant them. Because they will. They always do. And the next Sister Agnes might not survive to expose them. If you've made it to the end of this story, you've journeyed through one of the darkest chapters in American Catholic history, a chapter the Church tried desperately to bury for over a century. The case of Sister Agnes and St. Brigid's Convent represents everything this channel exists to expose. The abuse of power, the exploitation of the vulnerable, the use of respected institutions as cover for systematic evil. But here's what I need you to understand. This isn't just history. The patterns revealed in this case continue today. Institutions still demand unquestioning obedience. Authority figures still exploit trust. Whistleblowers still pay terrible prices for speaking truth. And victims still vanish into silence, their suffering hidden behind walls of respectability and power. If this story affected you, if it made you angry, if it made you question, if it made you recognize patterns you've seen in other contexts, then subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your theories about what happened to Sister Agnes. Did Mother Lucia's conspirators silence her? Did she flee to escape the trauma? Did she take her own life, unable to bear the psychological burden? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and whether you've ever encountered situations where institutions operated in secrecy while demanding trust. Have you ever been told to stop asking questions, to trust authority, to accept explanations that didn't quite add up? Have you ever felt like Sister Agnes, seeing something wrong but being told you're imagining things, being paranoid, being disrespectful? Because that's how evil perpetuates itself. Not through monsters who announce their wickedness, but through respected figures who silence questions, who punish curiosity, who reframe skepticism as disloyalty. Next week, we'll be covering another case from the sealed archives, the story of the Reverend Samuel Whitmore and the children who disappeared from his reform school in Maine during the 1870s. 43 students entered his institution. 17 were never seen again, and the explanation provided to their families was so mundane that no one questioned it, until a fire revealed what was hidden in the basement. But I'll leave you with this final thought. Somewhere in Boston, there's a small section of cemetery where 17 victims of St. Brigid's Convent are buried under a simple monument. Most people who pass it have no idea what it represents. Most people who see the words "innocence lost to corruption" assume it's about financial scandal, not murder. That's how history buries its horrors, not through conspiracy or cover-up, but through simple indifference and the passage of time. The victims become names on stones that no one reads. The heroes become forgotten footnotes. And the lessons remain unlearned until the patterns repeat themselves in new contexts with new victims. Sister Agnes exposed Mother Lucia's crimes, but she couldn't expose the systemic failures that enabled them. She couldn't change the fundamental human tendencies toward trusting authority and ignoring warning signs. She couldn't prevent the next institutional scandal, or the one after that, or the countless others that continue to this day. But you can help by staying skeptical, by asking questions, by never accepting "trust us" as sufficient explanation, by protecting those who speak uncomfortable truths rather than silencing them, by remembering that the most dangerous predators are the ones we're taught to trust without question. Remember Sister Agnes. Remember what she saw, what she exposed, what it cost her. And remember that somewhere, right now, another Sister Agnes is noticing patterns, asking questions, and deciding whether to speak up or stay silent. What happens next depends on whether we've learned anything from the crypt beneath St. Brigid's Convent, or whether we're doomed to discover that history's horrors are never truly past. They just find new forms, new institutions, and new victims. Until next week, stay vigilant, stay skeptical, and never forget, the most important question you can ask of any institution demanding your trust is simply this: what are they hiding behind their walls? This is Malevolent Memoirs, reminding you that some histories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deeply institutions try to hide them.